So we don't have anything very formal planned for this session. We were hoping to kind of brainstorm a little bit about how we can accomplish those 2018 speed goals that Ben and Annie and I discussed earlier in the main room. Just to remind folks, those goals were to load quickly, be responsive, and not run out of memory. We had a session earlier today that was kind of about how we can address the loading fast portion. So I was thinking we'd probably focus a little bit more on being responsive and not running out of memory, if that sounds reasonable to folks, but hoping to have a fairly organic brainstorm despite the kind of formal setup of the chairs, et cetera. Yeah, how should we be structuring this? I guess maybe it makes sense to start off talking about some of the existing efforts that are already happening in these spaces. Ben was just commenting that something like memory use, individual teams that are trying to optimize their own memory use can kind of make small incremental improvements. But our goal is to reduce out of memory crashes by 50% this year. We're not going to get there with small incremental improvements. We need to be pretty aggressive. So some stuff in the space that's kind of already happening for responsiveness. Out of process iframes are obviously going to have a pretty big impact on that when we have ads pushed out to a separate process. Something like expected queuing time improves a bunch for the top process. And then cooperative scheduling is another big effort there. We are recording. Yeah.
Does now process iframes hurt memory though? No.
Yes, absolutely.
So will it take effect on the device where OMs are actually important?
I believe the plan for UPIF is that it will be enabled for the subset of Android devices which are can be attacked via Spectre/Meltdown, which tends to be somewhat higher end Android devices. Low end Android devices have less RAM, so we couldn't do UPIF, but also most of them don't have issues anyways because they don't do CPU prefetching things. So
they won't help the low end devices.
UPIF will not help the low end devices, but we're hoping that cooperative scheduling will help in those circumstances.
We try to match some architecture change. Then we hope in 2 or 3 quarters when the business, we get some improvement, and we don't know how much.
Yeah.
So how can we be more scientific about
I can give
the limit of the theory?
I can give you a great example for cooperative scheduling. So cooperative scheduling, for folks who don't know, when we have a cross-origin iframe, we're going to say there are certain points in the execution of what this cross-origin iframe is doing where we can kind of pause what that the work on that cross-origin iframe is doing and go back to the main origin. So we have this finite set of safe points. And we're actually planning on, before we implement cooperative scheduling, plumbing all of those safe points into the thing that computes expected queuing time. So we can say, here's what your expected queuing time would have been if we had already implemented cooperative scheduling. So in that particular example, I think we've got a pretty good story. In general, I totally agree with you, though. So I'm hoping the format here will be kind of free-flowing brainstorm. Do folks have ideas on what can we do, what to make big improvements on responsiveness or out-of-memory crashes?
I have a question for everyone. So a lot of the devices that are out there are 512 megabytes. Do we think that we can hope to load pages reliably on those devices? The Android system uses a lot of memory. Chrome, loading a blank page uses a lot of memory. Together, I wonder, is there much room left? So if we all optimize Blink, as much as possible, are we still going to have loops with being out of memory? Should we give up?
Sounds like you're talking about previews to me.
No. I don't know if there's a solution. Even a preview, if we simplify the page. If the device has other things going on, just loading a page that just has some HTML text might limit.
I guess it's a question of, if that's the case, what's the optimal user experience? When they click a link, should we just tell them, sorry, this link doesn't work for you? Or we color the link a nasty color that indicates that their browser will probably crash if they click it?
Yeah, or put differently, why do we think that we can reduce memory use enough to like have a non-crashy phone or Blink browser on platform.
I think that the products we all see stories they do. So we have a different stories, and we're running them already on 1200 go. Last I know they do without there is not much else going on in the device. So that's I guess. Yeah, but I think it's probably.
Yeah, that's the question. So if there are any kind of things that you only want to device, within the Android OS, key results in the background instead of using phone.
Other apps supposed to, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or even the keyboard, for example. That's my most frequent frustration with a low memory device is every time I go to use the keyboard, it's been kicked out of RAM.
Super slow to come on.
Maybe we should go and talk to the keyboard owners and try to make keyboard faster and better.
Maybe try to load it a bit earlier.
So we did a reasonable job with Chrome. Maybe we should start going to the other Android phones and teach them the right way.
That's working for you.
That's the start.
Well, when you're using Chrome, you just use a keyboard that's rendered in HTML or something. Ugh. Yeah.
Actually, isn't that bad of an idea?
It seems like this kind of problem is not specific to us, right? I mean, people who do Google search and email and stuff like that. So this could be with okay, we optimize the heck out of it, but then has the stuff going on and the interface with users here.
I think platforms are in a somewhat unique position because the variety of content that we host is so diverse.
I do agree. I think that on we're going to be some website that no matter how we try, it's going to be impossible to render them correctly.
What does Android do if your app runs out of memory? Just kills it? I wonder how much they run into this problem compared to how much we run into it.
So what do you mean?
How often, so we have metrics on ohms per million page loads. Presumably Android also has metrics on out of memory per app launch or something. Be interesting to compare those. Because it's possible that we just like should set that as our target, and it's unlikely that we're going to be able to do better than Android apps in general.
How much memory? Sorry. I mean, it might be the case that pretty one devices don't have enough RAM when there are a lot of mobile websites. So maybe what should be done is somehow from that signal back to the website author. And I think Chrome is looking at some sort of self-service way of getting website owners to actually be able to look at how it comes to their page. That might be.
Yeah, I think the out of memory reporting API will be super useful here.
The surface on diagnosis those.
Probably. It's unclear to me how much the average web developer worries about ohms. Like what fraction of your page loads have to ohm before you start to care?
I guess you probably did.
Yeah?
Facebook probably that.
Oh,
I think it's as possibly can. Do the WordPress site item either.
right.
I also wonder whether that's the clustering of if you are a user who use 525, you're going to access certain kind of website for that market. And the website, so developers they know the audience, so they treat the customer differently from user for them.
There is a way to make web developers care about the out of memory kills. So Rick told in the keynote earlier today about PageRank, and that we are going to use mobile performance as a package PageRank. Maybe we should start counting all out of memory kills another signal.
The other
for a UA, it's for a device that's low memory.
For devices, yes. So ideally, all devices will have a
Got a couple hands.
You could both warn the user that this earbud is heavy and might cause a crash, or ultimately, I think some browsers in Firefox went with like a lighter read review version of the page.
Yeah, and Ben, you were mentioning you were concerned that even our previews would, in some cases, run out of RAM.
Well, so yeah, so I don't know the numbers, but there's like, so Android has some guidance on like how small an application should be. How much memory should you use to be like a good citizen? So that it's not like pushing other apps out of memory. Chrome is above that number without loading anything. And the memory of the renderer, single renderer, is like use is a lot without actually doing any work. Like on the orders of, like, I don't know if I can name numbers, but or say numbers here, but like 40-ish megabytes. Do nothing. So there's certainly some work we can do, like independent of optimizing pages, just on like maybe cutting some of the code out of them. Also browser side too, that's using memory as well. So like cutting that.
As it happens, we recently did this exercise.
Yeah.
Basically Chrome and took out as many features while still maintaining like a basic web browsing functionality, more or less. And turns out you can make like the APK a lot smaller and improve data speed, but like private third in memory footprint basically not like it's dead by 1,000 cuts.
Kenji, did you?
So one more place where we can in fact incentivize the web developers to develop tools would be to, if we had a way to surface that in their console where they get to see like monetization, like on video doing and like bidding on other paths, we perhaps like suggest that if they were to do something like tools, they would see like a plus 5% increase on their revenue. So that's another way to think about it.
So with Chrome's previews feature, one thing we were looking at is like, if is there a strong correlation between like the memory use of the page and the probability of theming? And what we see is like it is correlated, but it's the probability of theming increases with the size of the page, but there's not like above some level suddenly everything moves. So we're still looking for a clear signal that this page is like authored poorly enough that it's going to cause the which has been elusive. So, just size is not enough.
I kind of
Or memory.
capturing memory usage. I feel like there's a gap in attribution. For instance, on my phone, I look at the battery, I see the house. Battery is very etc. Right? But for memory inside Chrome, you don't really have the same kind of situation with the CPU monitor. At least on that, Chrome helper. So I'm usually like, oh, Chrome is using a lot of memory. In Safari, you'll see the actual like name of the site. You'll be like, oh, Google Drive, right? So I think, yeah, having clear attribution as to which tab, what site, changes the user perception, and I think it applies a lot more pressure on the site to feel like, oh, I'm getting called out everywhere. So it applies pressure for them to take it seriously. And I think it's hard to apply incentive for them to improve things without that kind of capability.
One thing that's not clear to me, if we did a perfect job of providing optimal messaging and optimal tooling to web developers, what fraction of our goals would we accomplish? I actually have no idea. It's possible that we could like achieve all our goals solely by doing that, and it's also, from my perspective, seems possible that we could get like 5% of the way and then get stuck. I'm really not sure.
I like the idea because most of the narrative we're hearing about memory is that Chrome is using a lot of memory, Chrome is such and such. But ultimately, a picture of that is
browser website is really developed. I think we have our fair share of optimization we can look at, but clearly the news website also have work to do. And perhaps if we have that narrative out there, like Gmail or whatever is using another method, we could get some help.
Can I ask a question about when you were saying about size and names? How are you measuring the size of the pages?
I have no idea. But so I'm not sure.
I think it's the private memory footprint.
Well, what is the private memory? I don't know exactly how.
So so I guess what I mean, by measuring it, are they like counting all the bytes for the resources, or are they like running Chrome with this page and saying, oh, it uses this much memory or something? Just wondered.
It is like thorough within Chrome instrumentation.
Right.
But the precise way the instrumentation works is complicated and it has to deal with like shared pages somehow. And it's complicated enough that I can never remember how it works.
Yeah, and I also don't remember exactly. If it's like polling and trying to find a peak, or
Yeah,
if it's just, or maybe it's at the onboard event.
Okay.
So usually, if we have certain very empty render process, it's only 40 megabytes. So what are the component including the concern so much?
So I'm not an expert on this, but I think like a lot of it is just code.
I think one thing too is just that spawning a process on Android is super heavy, where you need to have the whole like JVM stuff going, whether or not you're going to use it and that kind of thing. Yeah. I think someone has done research on like what makes up that 40 megabytes, but off the top of my head, I couldn't recite it. We've been talking a fair bit about memory. Any thoughts on what we could do about responsiveness?
Well, we're going to try and put some scheduler logic browser process. I imagine prioritizing inputs in the UI and IO codes. I don't know how much it will help, but I assume on low-end devices where both congested anyway, it might help more there.
Yeah, I think if we're blocked on the main, if the input is blocked on the main thread is basically always the bottleneck.
I mean about the browser.
Right, and I think even if we got rid of all queuing on the browser UI thread, it still wouldn't help too much, is my intuition. Depending on the kind of input, but like if you're talking clicking links, it's basically always that you get queued on the main thread because the main thread is executing 4 seconds of JavaScript.
And the browser thread.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Is if we make the browser UI thread perfect,
Yeah.
it doesn't help that much because we still hit the main thread and get queued on JavaScript.
So I was under the impression that you could see to the browser thread. That you were like 4 seconds of JavaScript just to create.
Yeah, like yes, the browser UI thread definitely can be bad, but I think relative to the render main thread, it's.
And the reason why I'm thinking browser thread will help because we've done a lot on the render thread to go and try and stop running tasks.
Still have some open. Yeah, I still need to read some notifications to prioritize input.
So I want to break these web apps and stuff like that.
I think we need to take another look. I maybe say that we want to break this up. That's how we want to prioritize input, and in some cases, the input can be the problem of that.
Regarding the amount of time spent blocked on the browser UI thread, I think we should just make some metrics and run some tests and actually figure out what fraction of the time input is spent blocking on the browser UI thread.
So I think another thing I'm hoping will help here is this. We're trying to move the 99%. Right? So very rare cases. Nice. So if we had rules that triggered slow report in this.
For context for folks, slow reports means that we get a trace, so a timeline from the wild when we hit some trigger.
So we can't go back.
Yeah, it have to be some kind of
Chicken
software
egg.
thing or
Really nice if you don't have a menu bar or something.
We could do that for ourselves. It's not, it'll be slower, but it's not. How much has there been a discussion around following the model similar to what Firefox quantum with being style layout or like from style pipeline onto
I think we lack the right folks in the room to really discuss that deeply. People have definitely thought about it. I think the general conclusion has been that it's not really worthwhile from our perspective. And we have some data that shows like relative to script, all of style, layout, and paint are like, I forget the exact ratio. We could pull the data pretty quickly, but it's not the big thing.
Do we know what, like, the typical use case of logging to the thread is what is blocking? Because we had some things like we ship intersection observer, we want, we do a occlusion detection that so care of that. So hopefully we can avoid having like unnecessary work for that part of the space. Maybe there is something similar for whatever is like the most open.
Yeah, I think the like stereotypical use case here is server-side rendering happens, server sends us exactly the content to display, we display it immediately, and then we run 10 seconds of JavaScript installing all our event handlers and instantiating objects for each like DOM element, that sort of thing. But we can't just say there's a single cause, but that's one of the big ones that we see a lot.
So one crazy thing is the UC browser. I played it, and they had a special mode where like this bypass back completely just if you do a scroll, let's just do a scroll.
I think all browsers do that. Unless like, so there are some cases where if you have non-passive event listeners,
Right.
you can block it.
The UC browser, they have the special method where they
Just
even
to
bypass
force all events to
Right.
be passive.
Right.
That's fine. At one point, we were talking about an intervention where we detect where the main thread is insufficiently responsive, and then we force all events to be passive. But we determined that would be a little bit too confusing for web developers to just have their event listeners stop behaving correctly at random points in time.
What about an intervention where you move JavaScript?
So the trick is JavaScript is always going to be causing layout and all kinds of other stuff, which is locked down to the main thread. It's not like we don't tend to be blocked by large chunks of JavaScript that are computing 700 digits of pi.
Do we know how much of that performance happens for those render chip
In theory, we should have that just because we have data from how big an impact UPIP had. But a bunch of our metrics didn't actually like behave correctly in the context of UPIF, so we've now done some fixing of metrics. Expected queuing time is the main example I'm thinking of. It wasn't ready for UPIF, so it broke. We fixed it, but now we don't have new data. So
In the server render case, where you get something that's made data contracting, then you end up with a bunch of JavaScript by like that contracting. Would it be possible for the developer to react to a user like input without having to wait for the communication to happen? Like, can they use the device to wants to interact with that thing on the screen and like do the right thing with that?
there have been a couple
If you have, like,
proposals.
APIs to make that happen.
Yeah, there have been a couple proposals here. The current like best practice, as far as I understand it, is you call set time at 0 a bunch of times up front with tasks that like do all of your loading. What you kind of want to do is like do a chunk of work, set time at 0, do a chunk of work. But because set time at 0 doesn't actually wait for no time at all, that doesn't quite work. So you do all your set time at 0s up front, and then you batch your work into small chunks, and that's super painful. The the two reasonable solutions to that seem to be, or the most reasonable solution to that seems to be set immediate or something similar. I'm also personally partial to like is there currently input pending API, but most people seem to think that's significantly too difficult for developers to use. They're probably right, but I still like it.
Quite the idea on the desktop. I have no sweep extension. So sometimes I browse some website and it becomes lucky or slow or annoying. I click the button and know the sweep when it becomes so much better. So that I wonder if we can do something like that and provide the incentive for developers say you are running too much scripts, so the user choose to not.
So we're literally experimenting with the no script intervention. Where we, in cases where we think that the disabling script still produces a useful page. And that part is far from that.
So another thing is we might want to add some safe points, JavaScript functions that the developer can explicitly say that they're fine with it.
How do you reason about that? So you say I'm calling this method and it can be interrupted at any time?
So basically you have a cycle which is loading, and after each iteration you call zero.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
Those control, I've seen some very nice prototypes based on promises.
Yeah.
Which actually speeds with
Yeah, and I think when I've proposed that, the feedback I've gotten is that we're worried developers will just do a like 20-second block with a bunch of yield calls, but that's still, they're just like doing lots of work, and that's bad.
How about something where you do a server-side rendering, you have an understanding of there are a bunch of payments that are about navigation. I assume that today we actually block if the method is busy. That's right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you will be able to say first thing you do, you set a bunch of input event handling workers for the DOM element and its subtrees. So you would be able to say, I know this is a navigation element. If it gets hit, I want this worker to be running, so I can do navigation, whatever is currently happening on it.
Yeah, so the trick is most things aren't just simple navigations. I have a doc that outlines a proposal for sending the link hit rex to the compositor. So when you touch on something on the compositor thread, we can start prefetching that. And so then after the JavaScript is run, if we do actually navigate, we've already prefetched stuff. It's a lot of complexity, and we haven't gotten around to implementing it yet.
So what I'm proposing is, let the developer receive an event whenever the user is touching something that is something we can do something about. Let the worker trigger a navigation. The event rate is currently doing something for the current page, but going to be automated because the user wants to navigate a web. So maybe we can do it this way.
Yeah, I guess it feels like we ought to be able to get most of the benefit without the developer opting in at all. Like you can imagine, we can identify cases where this is just a link, no JavaScript is going to execute. We need to do it on the compositor and say navigate. There's a lot of complexity there, obviously, but I think getting how much
the pages where interaction is actually bad. Is it likely that where to click on is actually just a link?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think prefetching is a fairly obvious win. Yeah, I'm not sure how often we would actually just directly navigate. And I guess Kenji's point is even in cases where we're not just directly navigating, you would potentially still be able to do the right thing in your worker.
That's a pretty good point. How much do we understand when you say every problem? What are they trying to do? Is it trying to make a score, or are they trying to click on the ruling, or they try to hit some button that does some complicated JavaScript?
Yeah, we do have metrics breaking this down. I don't remember the data off the top of my head, but anecdotally, I think the kind of classic case is I just want to click on a link, and I can't click on the link. I think we are out of time. Cool. Thanks for your ideas, everyone.